Hello and welcome to Scroll Ideas. Scroll Ideas is a new show by Scroll where every episode we'll take an idea that Indians are discussing and debating and look at it from every angle possible for an hour with a particularly brainy guest. And you'll be doing all of this with me, your host, Shoaib Daniyal. For this episode, I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Saran. Sham Saran retired from the Indian Foreign Service in 2006, and I think he's one of India's most well-known diplomats. I think there'd be many young men and women in Mukherjee Nagar right now preparing for their UPSCs who would want to follow in his have his career follow in his footsteps as we record this. He's been former foreign secretary. He served for 6 years in China. In fact, he's learned Chinese in Hong Kong, and using that knowledge, he's written a fantastic new book called "How China Sees India and the World," and that's what we'll be discussing over the course of the next 1 hour. Welcome to Scroll Ideas, Mr. Saran. Very pleased to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Before we go to the core of the book, which is how China sees India, I want us to see China a bit, as you've sort of mentioned a couple of times in your book, and it's blazingly true that we know very little about China in India. And one of the most interesting things I find about what you've written is that you kind of fact check the idea that China was somehow the center of the universe, center of the Asian universe. You say that it's a form of propaganda. It's a form of successful propaganda. Many people in the world have believed it. Many people in India believe it. In fact, growing up, I have constantly heard the trope that China's current rise is just it reclaiming its space that it always had before the rise of the West. It's almost an inevitability to it. So, what was China's space in the world, and how does it use that for modern politics?
Thank you very much, Shoaib. So, what I have tried to explain in the book is that not that China was not one of the largest and most prosperous economies in the world for quite a large part of its history. That is also true, by the way, of India.
Right.
These were the two countries which were very, very prosperous economies over a period of time. They were industrial economies as well. They were manufacturing economies, but manufacturing during the medieval period. But unlike India, which was very much open to the rest of the world, I have tried to point out that India really is a crossroads culture. Why? Because it was really at the intersecting point of the ancient, caravan routes linking, for example, the Indian subcontinent with Central Asia or with the Gulf, with Persia. It was also at the intersecting point of the ancient maritime routes. Because, if you look at India's shape as a peninsula and you take into account the fact that before the steamship came, essentially the sailings were determined by the wind patterns.
Winds.
And
Right.
so it is the monsoons which actually really determine the maritime routes during that period. So India was connected both with the east as well as with the western reaches of the Indian Ocean. So it was a very over the years it became a very cosmopolitan culture. China, on the other hand, was rich, was very prosperous, but at the same time, it was very much a insular economy.
Right.
It did not have much to do with the rest of the world. Yes, it had maritime trade. Yes, it had participation in the caravan trade, but that was peripheral. It was not something central to the Chinese economy. So when it is made out that China was, by the dint of its prosperity in the ancient period, was also somehow the kind of a nodal point in Asia during that period, that is simply not true. And if you look at the cultural impact, China did have a cultural sphere. If you take, for example, Korea, or you take Japan, or you also take, for example, Vietnam. These you can call part and parcel of what I would say a Sinosphere.
Right.
Very much influenced by Chinese language, Chinese script, Chinese, kind of rules of behavior in a sense, but not so much beyond that. India, on the other hand, first during the period when Hinduism spread to Southeast Asia, later on when Buddhism became a very major influence across this whole region, it in fact impacted very much on China itself, but
Right.
also much of Southeast Asia, and the legacy of that you can still see today. So the imprint of India in that sense over Asia was much deeper than the imprint of China, if one has to make a comparison.
Right.
So yes, China was a very important part through much of its history, but its influence compared to India was certainly much more limited. That is what comes out from the research that I did for them.
In fact, I mean, even if you just look at the two powers, I think even in medieval, till medieval, the medieval age, it was China that was influenced by India quite a bit more than vice versa, right?
Yes, so this is part of the reason, when I say that in India we know very little about China and we ought to know more about China,
Right.
is because while India, in a sense, left an imprint on China, essentially
Right.
because of Buddhism, but not just Buddhism, other factors also. You see very little imprint of China on India. You don't see people in India being curious about China.
Right.
Through the history. Yes, there was a long history of maritime contact between India and China.
Right.
Yes, during the earlier period, there was contact through, as I said, Buddhist priests or Buddhist monks going from India to China and vice versa, and they'll have left their accounts of their experiences, but it did not filter down to the people, except for
Right.
the way in which Buddhism filtered down to the people in China.
Right.
So it was even if the contacts were there, in India's case they were limited to a very small section of people, either people who were Buddhist, or people who were involved in the caravan trade, or people who were
Right.
involved in the maritime trade. But it did not really go into the people themselves.
Right.
So people in India were not very conscious of China, but China was at least in some vague way conscious of the fact that Buddhism, such a major influence on China, the origin of that was India.
India. And how does it use this? Give us a few examples of how China would use this in modern diplomacy.
No, so what China is been trying to put across, and as you mentioned in your opening remarks, that this is something which has been, in a sense, swallowed by a lot of Western scholarship, but also has influenced maybe some Indian thinking about China. It is that China was a center of culture and civilization, and it had concentric circles of less cultured, less civilized countries on its periphery.
Right.
And that these countries were paying tribute to China, acknowledging China's very superior status or its very powerful status, and that this was the order of things for many centuries. And therefore, this is also the reason why I talk about China's sense of looking at power in a very hierarchical sense. That we are at the top, and then you have ranked below China various other countries in the region. And so China went through a period where, because of the impact of imperialism, because of aggression by the imperial powers and Japan, it fell into a kind of a semi-colonial status. But China has re-emerged and is taking its place, which was it evolved on it by history. This is the kind of a natural order of things.
Right.
and therefore China should be given the kind of respect and reverence by others in the region, because this is what was the natural order of things in the past. So this is something that needs further study and further research. Like, for example, the tribute system. That throughout history, the lesser countries around China's periphery, they acknowledge the superior status of the Chinese emperor, and they would send these delegations offering gifts, etc., to the Chinese emperor, acknowledging that they are a vassal of the great Chinese empire, and then they would be given some honor or will be given even more gifts in return. So this was a whole system that was in place of these countries on the periphery acknowledging China's superiority, acknowledging China's power. So this tribute system is now being presented that in the modern period, even though we don't now have the tribute system, but you see that particular system which was put in place, which kept in a sense the peace in the region. This is what is being recreated in the modern period. So this is why I say that when China is looking at what should be the new Asian order, if it is going to replace the United States as the leading power in the region, what should that Asian order look like? So in Chinese sense, that Asian order should really look like a hierarchical order headed by China.
Right.
And others should know their place in the ranking system.
Right.
In a sense. So I have referred to a particular incident from 2010, when there was a meeting of the ASEAN Regional Forum, and there were the smaller ASEAN countries, and there was the Chinese foreign minister, and some of the Southeast Asian countries had raised the issue of the South China Seas, and what China was doing in the South China Seas. And this foreign minister got very upset and angry, and he said, you should realize that China is a big country and you are just small states, and that is just a fact. So, that in a sense very easily reflected what really China thinks about this relationship with the smaller countries of Asia. That, there is a certain kind of, as you said, an inevitability of China's, sort of dominant position. Yeah.
Right. I want to also ask you, just delve a bit deeper into China's history before moving on to how it's looking at us. You brought up this comparison with India, that India was actually at the crossroads. And of course, there were two, large entities in Asia. One of the couple of differences though between China and India's history that I find very interesting is, one is China actually does have a fairly long history of centralized state, so to speak, that maybe Indians, it's a bit more, federalized, for lack of a better word. The second is China really has, and you see this even in modern politics today, has this long continuity of a sense of history. And one of the fascinating things I found about your book is that Mao claims Temur for himself, because I guess China is part of Mongolia, is part of is China. So he sort of uses that in the debates leading up to the 62 war. So this is really fascinating. It's something that I think is missing maybe in Indian discourse. I can't think of too many 800-year-old debates coming up in our politics, unless it's maybe in the worst way possible. But what leads to this? Is it because of one of the things you maybe point? Is it because of language? Is it the fact that they've got this incredible sort of pictorial script that they can read maybe across time? Is it the fact that the hand race is very homogeneous and is very large? What leads to this?
So this is a somewhat complex story. So I don't think we can, simplify it in the manner of just, some very generalized kind of observations. Let me just make 2 or 3 points. One, as you mentioned, the script is a very important unifying factor. As I have pointed out in the book, that Chinese spoken language may be very different in different parts of China. So I mentioned, for example, that if I, as a student, when I went to Guangzhou, the southern part of China, I could not make head or tail of what was being said to me
So it's
in
practically a
Cantonese.
different language from Mandarin.
Completely,
Right.
completely. But you see, the script is the same.
Right.
So I could make myself understood by just writing out what I wanted to.
Okay.
And similarly,
Right.
my interlocutor would be able to do the same by just writing
Right.
out what he wanted to say to me. So the script, as far as the Han areas are concerned, not Tibet, not Xinjiang, but the rest of China, the script is the same. So this
Right.
is a very unifying factor. So that is one important thing. In India, what was the difference? In India, you had classical Sanskrit, which, by the way, also spread to Southeast Asia.
Right.
Many of the languages of Southeast Asia, as you know, have some derivation from ancient Sanskrit. But the difference between Sanskrit and Chinese was that Sanskrit was spoken the same no matter where you were using this language. Whether you were using it in India, whether you were using it in Java, or whether you were using it in some other, kingdom like Cambodia, where the elite prided themselves in knowing Sanskrit, because the Sanskrit has very strict rules of pronunciation.
Right.
So there is only one correct way of
Correct way to
pronouncing,
say it.
using Sanskrit.
In fact,
So
the scripts were different very often of Sanskrit,
right.
but the
So the
pronunciation was
script could be Kharoshti,
Right.
script could be Brahmi, script could be
Right.
Siddham script. So the scripts could be different, but the spoken language was the same. Exactly the reverse of what you find in China.
Right.
One very important difference. Second, you mentioned about that sense of centralized control, which is also we see in the one-party Leninist state. Yes, to some extent, that is really a legacy of history. But I would also like to point out that people think that there has been one continuous line from the ancient dynasties to the present, as if this is a completely unbroken history, which is simply not true.
Right.
Like India, which went through different empires, you had periods when there were very strong centralized empires like the Mauryan Empire, or you had the Gupta Empire. If you take the Mughal Empire, also fairly strong and covering a large part of the subcontinent.
Right.
Certainly the most recent one, the British, also covered most of the subcontinent.
Right.
What I'm trying to say is that ebb and flow of history is not very different in China.
Right.
Chinese want to suggest that there is a continuous line of great empires, and China now becoming the latest
It's a
version
form
of
of
those
myth
great
making
empires.
again.
They were like India. China went through periods of consolidation.
Right.
It went through long periods of fragmentation.
Right.
When they say India, you see, was occupied by foreigners, for a large part of its history, and that may explain why the Indians have some kind of a slavish mentality, not acknowledging that for 50% of their own history, China was under alien empires.
Right.
The latest one, the Manchus,
Manchu.
that empire came to an end only in 1911. So this is where I have talked about, it's very important for us to also delve a little deeper into what real history is. Because we may think, oh, India was never a united country. It was always, there were a number of scattered principalities. So did China. And it was not that India never had, consolidation. There were periods of consolidation in India as well. There was always a sense of India, and the geographical kind of limits of that idea of India is very ancient.
A
It's not
strong
that
sense of
this
cultural
is,
unity.
yeah, the people who may think that, oh, this is a legacy of the British Empire, that's simply not true.
Right.
Even if you go back into history, very long ago, say during the Mauryan period, there is a sense of, India being what it is, a subcontinent.
Right.
In fact, even included a place like Afghanistan in that empire.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that, one should be mindful of the fact that history is far more complex. And it is not that one simple narrative, can actually encompass or capture that history. So there are periods where China has been more united, more consolidated, but there have also been periods where it has not been, and it has been very much fragmented. Lastly, I would also like to point out that it is true that in most of Chinese history, there was a sense that it is in periods of strong central authority,
Right.
strong central leader or an emperor, that China had periods of relative peace and relative prosperity. It is when the center was weak, when the leadership was not very a good leadership, that China suffered from fragmentation and suffered from economic distress. Therefore, in popular perception, there is a kind of a underlying preference, in a sense, popular preference. Oh, we need to have a strong, central authority, because that is the way how China can remain united, and also China can become economically more prosperous. Perhaps that kind of sense of strong central leadership and a strong central authority may not be as strong a preference in India as it is in China. That one should acknowledge.
And I think that leads directly to the sort of unitary state that the Communist Party has set up, right? I think this thinking
Yes,
that it's
so
good to have a
a
unitary
one
centralized
party
state.
Leninist state was easy to establish in China because of that particular historical
Thinking.
preference.
Right.
That it did not come out as a complete departure from the past. It was in some sense in line with that preference.
Right. And I think here in India, the fact that, we're democratic federal is almost the fact that we don't have this thinking that somehow hyper centralization is something great.
Yeah, that having a strong central authority is indispensable to a strong state.
State. Right.
That kind of equivalence may not be there in India in the same manner that it is there in China.
Right. Now to come to the core of your book, Mr. Saran, how China sees India. One of the things that you say, of course, till the modern age, China didn't actually see much of India. But in the modern age, unfortunately, China had developed a pretty negative view of India from, say, the late 1800s onwards. One point of that, as you point out in the book, as readers will find out when they read the book, is because British used Indian troops to wage war on China, to put China into semi-colonized states in 1900. Indian troops unfortunately sacked Beijing. In I think right till 1994, the Indian Army had a bell from the Temple of Heaven that they returned, as you mentioned in your book. A couple of years back, I had read Julia Lovell's Global History of Maoism, and she pointed out a very interesting incident where it said that in 1925, actually Indian constables had opened fire in Shanghai, killing 11 Chinese. And the Communist Party actually used that as propaganda, and it was a big part of the explosion. So Indians have a small role in the Chinese Communist Party. Uh, do those ideas still exist? Unpack this for us. How bad were perceptions of India? Do they still exist? For example, if a couple of Chinese are talking together about the Quad, would they be looking at early 1900s history and say, "Oh, look, that's how Indians are"? Like, is that, does that negative stereotype still uh, function in
Uh,
fashion
uh,
their thinking?
yes, those templates of the past do influence perceptions at present. And that's not just true of Chinese perceptions of India, they are also true of how we see,
Right.
China, or how we see many other, relationships. But I think two things. I would say that this negative perception of India is not that it is all dark and black.
Right.
I would say that maybe we should be a little more nuanced in making that observation, because it is also true that at some level there is an acknowledgement that okay, at a certain point of history, India was like an alternate center of civilization and culture.
Right.
You know, and that comes from what I mentioned earlier, the spread of Buddhism, for
Right.
example, in China, or the accounts of Chinese travelers to India
Right.
during that period when they went back and they related how this was a very very prosperous and a very very strong empire, and a center of knowledge in a sense, because you remember this was the period where you had the Nalanda University, you had the Vikramshila University. So India was also seen as a center for knowledge and culture.
In fact, I think the
So
peak of
yes,
Chinese intellectuals would be come to India, learn Sanskrit, and translate.
right,
Right.
right.
That would be
So
like
there,
your PhD of the
so
time.
India did not fit into that mandala, as I say.
Right.
That here is a center of civilization and everything around it is less and less culture.
Right.
India was not the less cultured part of the periphery.
Right.
It was an alternate center of culture and civilization. And in some sense, it could even be said to be superior. Because after all, it was China which was learning from India.
From India.
It was Buddhism which came from India to China. So in some sense, there was a acknowledgement that India is the home of very advanced culture and civilization. Now, as I said, there was a long hiatus of nearly 700-800 years, where essentially each country fell off the other's radar screen.
Yeah.
But Chinese still had the lingering perception of there being an India, which was the source of Buddhism and
Right.
was a very advanced culture. That, in some way, perceptions survived. Now, even when China came face to face with India during, for example, the Opium Wars, uh, as you said, as the shock troops of the British assaults on China, uh, it is not that sense of India having been at some point an advanced civilization that was completely lost. Secondly, during our own independence struggle against British colonialism, there was also a sense of some kind of a mutual support and sympathy, because
Asian
after all, we were
solidarity.
fighting against the
Same enemy.
same adversary, and you had people like Rabindranath Tagore, or you even had somebody like Mr. Nehru, who supported the Chinese Revolution. So there were elements which were positive, but if you ask me, what is the relative balance in terms of the negative perception and the positive perception? The negative perception was certainly much more than the positive perception. And 1962, when it happened, it in a sense confirmed India's position in a lesser category than China. Because after all, you were defeated. So then you could be put in the same kind of mandala of China being the center of Asia, the most powerful country in Asia, and others being sort of lesser powers who needed to defer to China's centrality, to China's dominant status. So 62 had that very negative impact because in a sense it confirmed Chinese sense of superiority, that the only other possible rival power had been put in its place.
In fact, I wanted to unpack this a bit more. So, I mean, in 62, India and China were kind of matched. Maybe India was maybe a touch richer, actually. I'll have to go and check the figures, but at the very least, matched. In 2020, what happened in Galwan, there was this unprovoked Chinese aggression. It took Indians by surprise. It took maybe even the government of India by surprise. Uh, how much of that do you draw from this Chinese sense of hierarchy? I don't know. Is it drawn from Confucian thoughts? The fact that the world exists in a hierarchical relationships, humans exist in hierarchical relationships, nations exist in hierarchical relationships, and how much of that has got to do with the fact that China is now, it's a real thing that China is much richer than India today.
Both, I would say. One reinforces, in a sense, the other. Chinese external relationships are very much influenced by their sense of what the balance of power is.
Right.
So even in respect of India, just take the what the Chinese say could be the way to resolve the border issue. So after 1962, you had what is known as the package proposal, which basically was that you keep what you have in the east, we will keep what we have in the west, and on that basis, we can solve the problem.
Right.
Which India was not prepared to accept. That this would be in a sense legalizing or legitimizing the fruits of aggression by China. But you come to 1985, just a few years after Deng Xiaoping has already conveyed publicly this package proposal that I mentioned, Chinese then changed the goalposts. And they say, well, the package proposal, it has been misunderstood by you because we have a larger dispute in the eastern sector. You have to make significant or meaningful concessions in the east, and we will make some corresponding concessions in the west. So already the package proposal has been sort of,
Taken
in a
off the
sense,
table.
redefined.
Redeveloped, yeah.
Essentially because they came to a sense that the power gap between India and China had changed more in their favor. Then you have 1987, when India declares Arunachal Pradesh as a state of India, and then China raises a new demand that in any settlement, you have to give back Tawang to China. Knowing full well that this would be a very difficult thing for India to countenance. So if you look at the way things have been moving on the issue of the border, you will see that there is a constant change in the goalposts as Chinese perception of what the power balance is has kept on changing. So I put Galwan in that context, that at least since 2007-2008, the gap in capabilities between India and China has actually been expanding. So if you take the growth rate of India, say before 2007-2008, it may have been 8 or 9%, even 10% a couple of years per annum. China's economy was slowing down. It had come down from the very high figures before. It was coming down to an overall rate of about 6% or 6.5% per annum. There was a sense during that period that India was going to be the next China, the next big opportunity for the rest of the world. And it was a country with much greater capabilities than the world had realized. Now, that changed. Perception changed in 2007-2008 because our growth rate went down. The Chinese recovered very quickly. Also, don't forget that the gap between China and the US also started shrinking after the global
Pandemic.
So in China, there has been a sense for the last several years that, relatively speaking, the balance of power has been changing in favor of China. And therefore, China does not need to be as sensitive to the concerns of its neighbors and other countries as may have been the case in the past. That we can actually assert our interests much more aggressively than we have been able to do in the past. You see this not only on the India-China border, but you see, for example, in the South China Seas.
Right.
So it is very much linked to Chinese perception of what the balance of power is. And so I would like to just mention one quote from President Xi Jinping, where he is describing the tremendous transformation which is taking place in global geopolitics. So he describes it by saying, we are going through changes not seen in a century. That is how historic these changes are. Then he says that the balance of power has changed, but more importantly, that this balance of power has changed irreversibly.
Right.
Meaning thereby that the China is now in a situation where its dominant status, both regionally as well as globally, can no longer be challenged. So this is very important to understand the backdrop to some of those changes that are taking place, not only with respect to India, as I said, but we have to take it in the context of how China is relating to the rest of the world, how China is relating, for example, to the United States, or how is it relating to Western Europe and to Asia itself.
Do you think Ukraine puts a spanner in their works? Their ally Russia has done something cruel and stupid.
So I have said that maybe this was a miscalculation on the part of China. That perhaps they may not have anticipated that Russia will actually invade Ukraine. Certainly, I don't think they had anticipated that the war will go on for such a long time. I think not just China, but I think even in the West, there was a sense that, faced with this massive, military push by Russia, the Ukraine government would crumble within a few days and some kind of a peace would be imposed upon it. I think it came as a surprise to Russians, but also came as a surprise to the West when the Ukrainians actually started fighting back.
Right.
This was not in the script, in a sense. So this also has created a dilemma for China. Because the longer this war goes on, and also when they have seen how Russia has actually been completely unplugged from the global system. So if the West was so weak, if the West was no longer what it had been in the past, if the balance of power had changed irretrievably in favor of China,
Right.
then how is it that the West is still able to do all this?
Right.
So there may have been a miscalculation, as I said, that perhaps we declared victory too early. And maybe we need to reassess where we are and what really the balance of power is. Because in the current situation, we find that the global financial system is dominated still by the West. That as far as technology is concerned, in many areas, the West is still the repository of the most sophisticated technologies in the world. After all, if you take the technology companies, the four most important companies in the world are all American.
Right.
Microsoft or Google or Amazon. If you take the really top companies, which are those companies? So there is a sense, at least I find in the Chinese language literature, I find that there are people who are questioning the assumption that the West is now in terminal decline.
Right.
That maybe it has still some steam left in it, and China should perhaps reassess its position.
I want to go back to perceptions, Mr. Saran. So there's this quote that many of our readers would probably have heard of. It's by Hu Shi, a Chinese diplomat of the early 20th century. He says that India conquered and dominated China culturally for 20 years without ever having sent a single soldier across our borders. This is something that I learned from Saran's book, that this is actually a quote quite critical of India. It's meant to.
Yeah, in fact, many people in India quote it as if it is very complimentary to India. It is exactly the opposite.
I've heard it all my life being quoted complimentary, as you pointed out. Defense Minister Rajnath Singh also pointed it out.
Yeah.
So I think this really exemplifies, again, something that you pointed out, is that we know very little, honestly, about China. How do you think? I mean, firstly, how little do we know, and how do you think that impacts us in our dealings with China? Because at the end of the day, it's a behemoth on our border, an aggressive behemoth on our border.
Well, isn't it rather self-evident that if China is your most significant challenge today, and it's likely to become an even greater challenge going forward, then how you deal with this challenge? And I do not mean only in terms of opposing China. I don't mean only in terms of trying to contain China either by ourselves or in collaboration with others. Even in terms of trying to find some kind of an understanding with China. So not just the negative aspect, but also the possibility of some positive relationship going forward. That is only possible if there is a better understanding between the two countries. And by the way, Chinese are as ignorant about India as we are about China. There are also stereotyped images about India in China, just as there are stereotyped images of China here in India. So what you need to do is to start clearing that kind of what I have called the sludge of prejudice on both sides. And our current studies on China, our current sort of analysis on China is very much focused on the security aspect. It is very much focused on the defense aspect. We want to know what China's foreign policy is. We want to know what China's military policy is. But unless you have that broader context of understanding Chinese politics, understanding Chinese culture, understanding China's history, and how China itself interprets its history. Because I'm not saying that it is only that historical experience which determines China's current position. There are many new things which are happening in China. But there is a certain template of the past which does influence the prism through which they are looking at the world. So this is something which is absolutely critical in terms of India's safeguarding its own interests. That you must know what your adversary is like, what are the drivers of Chinese thinking, not only with respect to India, but with respect to the rest of the world as well.
I'm going to ask you a bit of a pointed question, Mr. Saran. Do you think that this is also partly responsible for the 62 debacle that, for example, you point out that Mao was involved in a struggle with the rightists at that time? Yes. And that was one reason maybe why he was so...
And the India-China, conflict became entangled in that domestic politics.
Right.
But most people in India were not even aware of what was happening domestically in China. Right. So there is always a link between, foreign policy as well as domestic politics. You see that in India today itself. It's very difficult to understand India's foreign policy today without looking at what is happening in India domestically, right?
Right.
So China is no different. So we have to keep a careful watch. What are the political dynamics which are unfolding domestically in China? And how is that likely to impact, therefore, how China is behaving externally? There is that link. So you need to have much greater knowledge about China. You need to have many more people who, for example, are fluent in Chinese, who can read and speak Chinese, because knowing the Chinese language is very important in terms of understanding Chinese way of thinking. How many people in India even know that Chinese, for example, has no alphabet? Right. I'm surprised so many times that people don't even, they react with great surprise when I tell them there is no alphabet. This level of ignorance can be, I think, very damaging to our interests. So part of the reason why I wrote this book was to at least alert people that study of China, much broader study of China, is very important. And by the way, also, this is an absolutely fascinating country. It's not only that you need to know about China because of the fact that it's a security challenge to India. But I think it is also worth knowing more about China, because I certainly found in my many years of engagement with China that it is a very fascinating country. It has a very, very rich culture. Its literature is really something very profound. So from those points of view also, not necessarily only from the negative point of view, but for many other reasons.
Just for knowledge sake, in some ways.
It is
humanity, right?
Yeah.
Right. Just continuing with the India-China comparison, Mr. Saran, this is something that you'll hear, at least I hear constantly in India, is that people look to China and conflate its economic success with the fact that it has a one-party Leninist state, and the converse is that India is being held back by its democracy, by its pluralism. That's something that you contest in your book. Could you unpack that for us? What do you think is democracy for India?
So one, I have tried to point out that our historical experience, our trajectory through history has been very different from China. So we should understand, our two countries have, in a sense, evolved very differently. And that should come as no surprise because our geographical position is different, our cultural experience is different, the kind of, challenges that we may have faced through history are different. Therefore, there is no one size fits all kind of a, political dispensation that, this political dispensation is equal to economic success. That's not really the case. So we have to determine what best suits us. So this is where I have pointed out that China's great advantage is its relative homogeneity and the fact that it has a language, for example, if not the spoken language, it has a script which is understood across China. It is true that Chinese have great difficulty in dealing with Tibet. They have great difficulty in dealing with Xinjiang because they are essentially don't fit into that kind of Chinese perception of a unified culture. India, throughout its history, has actually been a very plural society. Sanskrit may have given rise to different languages, and their connections with Sanskrit you can still find.
Right.
But we have very rich languages, and each of the languages actually has its own very, very rich historical tradition and literary tradition.
Right.
These are very advanced languages. Okay. Then we have a tremendous variety in terms of our religious practices, in terms of our cultural practices, in terms of our cuisine, in terms of the way we dress. So there is a huge variety. I mean, the most striking feature about India is, in fact, its diversity. And yet, there is that history of togetherness, a sense of, shared cultural experience, a shared, affinity in a sense of our culture, which is also very, very strong. Also something which has evolved over hundreds of years. So in India, celebrating diversity has been actually an asset because you have been open to the rest of the world. Therefore, as I say, you are a very cosmopolitan culture. You are a very adaptive culture. I mean, if you look at the experience of the Indian diaspora, for example,
Right.
the fact is that they are some of the most adaptable people anywhere in the world.
Right.
So this is why I say that, your strength, unlike the Chinese, your strength is your capacity, your ability to handle immense diversity. That you have managed to look at plurality as a source of strength, not as something which is undermining you. So plurality is not something which is incompatible with a strong state. Unlike China, which believes that a strong state cannot tolerate great heterogeneity. In our case, our whole historical experience has been that actually, plurality has been one of the underlying strengths of this country and of this culture. And in that sense, why is democracy important? Because it is a political dispensation which allows you, in fact, to manage this plurality.
Plurality.
So among all the different political dispensations that you could have selected, you could have gone for, this in a sense, and I think there was this wisdom of our leadership, that they saw that in managing this plurality, quite apart from cultural norms or various kinds of social norms, what really would be very, very helpful in terms of managing this plurality would be actually a democratic dispensation, both in terms of the federal structure, but also in terms of allowing different constituencies to really find place for themselves to develop their own genius. This is what really is important for India. So I think this kind of a very superficial judgment that unless India becomes something like China, unless it becomes very centralized and very very strong leadership, strong state, it will not be able to develop. That is, I think, a completely wrong judgment. And the period that we actually grew very rapidly, that in a
Right.
sense tells you that it is not incompatible.
It was a time of political fragmentation, actually. Right.
In many ways,
Yeah.
so it is not that centralized kind of a political dispensation is indispensable to your achievement of your economic and social goals.
In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that given our history, actually we make ourselves weaker if we ignore
Oh,
plurality. Right.
no doubt about that. You see, every time somebody gets up on his hind legs and talks about how Hindi must be the national language and should be therefore universalized all across India, you see how you have a reaction. So actually insisting on some kind of homogeneity is a recipe for fragmentation. I
In
think we
fact,
have to recognize that the Indian case, it
right.
is exactly the opposite.
And
Yeah,
we've seen
that
it in South Asia. I mean, that's where Pakistan messed up. I
that
mean, if
yeah,
we could,
yeah,
sort of,
yeah.
so I mean,
So
they tried
our
to have this homogeneity and they messed up in 71,
yeah,
right?
and the fact is that you are not homogeneous.
Right.
I mean, merely by trying to say that you are one country, one language, one culture, actually, that does not mean that reality will change to conform to that judgment.
Yes.
No. So it is impossible. I have said this before also, that it is impossible to put a monochromatic frame on this kind of a very diverse reality that India is. And if you try to do that, that creates more problems rather than solve.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Saran. I think this was a rich discussion that we've had. Hopefully, you'll be writing more about China, and we'll be reading and listening to you uh, about China and maybe other things. Um,
Thank
I'd like to see you write about Chinese food once, Mr. Saran.
well, you already have experience of Indian Chinese food, so yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
again, for our viewers, the book is How China Sees India and the World. Uh, Give it a read, it's quite interesting. Thank you so
Thank
much for joining us on Scroll Ideas, Mr. Saran. If you liked what you saw, I'd urge you to go to scroll.in/contribute so that we can continue to do the work we do. Thank you so much for watching.